Welcome everyone. I'm Yair Valach. I'm the head of the Center for Jewish Studies. We don't do usual seminars, kind of bi-weekly, but this was an opportunity that I couldn't miss. These two speakers that we have this evening. Let me introduce our first speakers. First speaker tonight, this evening. This is Professor Benite. He's a professor of history from NYU, a historian of China and the Middle East. Among his publications are The Tao of Muhammad, Cultural History of Muslim in Late Imperial China, The 10 Lost Tribes, and the anthology Modern Middle Eastern Jewish Thought, which was a landmark anthology of texts by modern Middle Eastern Jewish intellectuals in the 19th and 20th century. And this evening he'll talk about Yemenite Jews between two oceans, cotton, steam, and early Zionism.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, and thank you for putting this together on such a short notice. And I'm also grateful and honored to be here on a panel with Eirik to talk about the Indian Ocean. I was unable to print my talk, so I'm embarrassingly going to read it from an iPad, but I rather speak a little bit from that. So I would like to talk about two basic aspects of Jews in the Indian Ocean and commerce and mostly labor. At the turn, a little bit in the 19th century, just to give us a little bit of a background, and to use it as a foil to what happened with the case of a rather famous case of the bringing of Yemeni Jews in 1910, a few hundred of them from Yemen to then emerging mandatory Palestine for workers. And I'm going to just compare these two cases together for some conclusions and some sort. It's going to be a rather short, and one of the things that you will see is that I'm going to be interrogating a text that is rather famous in the history of Zionism, but I'm going to offer today a rereading. So let's begin with the foil, and I'd like to basically return to what I did here in 2019 when we had 3 days at SOAS hosted by the Center for the Study of Iraq, discussing the history of Iraqi Jewry. I presented here the case, the very, very famous case of Iraqi Jews going to India and to China. And so on. So the story is, I recently published an article about that. The story is very, very simple and very famous. The British Empire find itself in the South Continent, and later on in China. My little 2 cents on this very famous story is that I was looking at the writings of James Rennell, who was a major geographer, a very famous geographer in the 19th century in London and in England. It was completely forgotten in the 20th century, but was quite central before that. He was for a while the main geographer of Bengal. He was studying water. And he was a water surveyor. He invented the science of oceanography, which is an unbelievable science, and he had very, very interesting insights into understanding, what is the ocean. You can't think about the ocean differently. You think about the ocean differently after you read Rennell. Rennell, for a very, very bizarre mixture of rereadings of biblical texts, Greek texts, which he read with friends, and all sorts of myths and tales after he came back from Bengal to London. Wrote a 900-page book, which is the history of Asia and the geography of Asia based on Herodotus, in which he basically planted a chapter that was about the lost tribes of Israel. this is why I got into this. I wrote a book about the lost tribe of Israel as a geographical myth, interrogating the applications of this myth into the expansions of empires, particularly from the Age of Sail until the rise of the British Empire. And there he makes a proposition based on pseudo-epigraphical biblical text and also biblical text, which he rereads. Something very simple. The British Empire would do great if they move Jews to its newly acquired territories in the east. They're going to serve there as middlemen, as accountants, as people who basically move the finances of the empire, and he goes into great detail in order to prove all of that. Okay. He writes this in 1800, and he presents this book to the Lord of the Admiralty at that time, Spencer. I think he's like the great-great-great-great-grandfather of Princess Di. I went yesterday to the park to worship there, And, he says this is a tool of empire which we need to imitate, and he basically talks about this as a tool of empire. So it's a very, very classical role of reading of Jews as middlemen in a minority. We can see this is in Armenians, in all the other people as well, as middlemen, in the service of an expanding empire. This is what he proposes. Now, I don't know if anybody really read him seriously. It's a very big book. But the point is that as history shows us that 30 years later, quite miraculously, we see the Sassoons and other Iraqi Jews arrive in from Baghdad via very traditional networks of via the Persian Gulf, all the way to, first of all, to India, and then from there also to Shanghai, and the rest is history. Opium, lots of riches, and so on and so forth. Okay. So these people make a lot of money. And one of the things that we see of how this money comes back to the Middle East is in the form of, for example, let's take the Kaduris. The Kaduri family invests in education in the Middle East. They build schools in Baghdad, that raise the level of literacy among the Baghdadi community, Baghdadi Jewish community. They build other schools as well. The highlight of it is like already in the 19th century, they make a donation and they build 2 Kaduri schools in Palestine. One of them is for Jews. That is the famous Kaduri school where Israeli Prime Minister went to school. Yitzhak Rabin was studied there, in the 1930s. And then the second one is in Tulkarm for Palestinians. Okay, which until today carries the title Kaduri College. So this is basically, and they do all sorts of other things. They do ethnographies. There's a very famous ethnography of one of the Sassoons, how he travels all the way from Bombay via the Gulf, all the way to Shat al-Arab, to Basra, and then to Baghdad, and he basically does an ethnography of his own community in Baghdad. Okay. So these are really, really classic development. Ethnography is not exactly classic, but this is what people do when they do an empire. They do ethnographies for the service of the empire. So the Jews do that in this context. And in this case, there's no really difference. All you can see is that, the role of the middleman and the role of the, let's say, accountant and the finance manager is done in the East on steroids. Okay? It's capitalizing on existing networks. But suddenly the presence of the British Empire and the British India Company already in the 18th century puts this on a completely different level, and some other people capitalize on that. Okay, I'm more familiar with the situation in Baghdad. So if you go to in Shanghai in that period, you have about 300 very, very wealthy Jews and about 700, not so wealthy Jews whom they hire from Baghdad and they bring them. And this is going on back and forth all the time. And we now today know that the community in Baghdad was heavily invested in the trade because they were sending the finances back and forth by way of donation. That's our foil. Okay. Now, let's move to 1910. And in 1910, we see a different type of, a different case that is going on. That involves a different type of an Indian Ocean or a Jewish community that has access to the Indian Ocean. And I'm talking about Yemeni Jews. Okay. And the background is very, very simple. I mean, we are now in the very, very early stages of Zionist settlement in Palestine, heavily aided by finances from the Rothschilds or Baron Hirsch and so on, which they buy land and they settle people on the land. You know, and in the literature, we're talking about these people as planters. You know, they have they plant, they basically develop, and this is also the beginning of agricultural capitalism in Palestine. Okay, and I should say Zionist agricultural capitalism in Palestine. Now, there are two problems that they run into very, very quickly. One problem is that if you're a capitalist, you know, and that means that you read Das Kapital, it means that you need to make money, right? You need to exploit. You need to basically take people, make sure that they work, and you make profit out of their labor. Okay. That's the capitalism side. Okay. But then there is the Zionist side, and the Zionist side basically says, okay, you need to hire Jews. There are, of course, plenty of laborers in Palestine at the time. You know, these are the Palestinians. And they work for an X amount of money, 2 bishliks, 3 bishliks. This is Ottoman currencies. It's not very, very important. It's very, very low money. Okay, very low wages. And the rich Jewish planters who get the land that is being purchased, you know, they hire them. Okay, they hire these Palestinian workers, and this brings Zionism and capitalism into conflict. So what do you need to do? You need to actually hire Jews. Now, I do a very, very close reading of a lot of texts about, you know, what's going on at that period. And we can see that the early Zionists run into two problems. Number one is you have all of these Jewish pioneers, Zionist pioneers, who come from Europe, and they complain about it all the time. These people come from Europe to Palestine as Zionist pioneers. And they're not very good workers for two reasons. First of all, they have serious issues adapting to the land. Okay? Too much sun, too hot, etc. The second problem, and it's amazing how much they complain about it, they have in their pocket like all sorts of ridiculous ideas about rights. Yes, or they call it like they have Mr. Marx in their pocket. In other words, they want to have better wages than the Palestinian workers. Okay. So what to do? So now we have a different situation. You know, you need to turn to other populations that have to be Jewish, yes, that somehow are adapted to, you know, to the culture and to the climate, not to the culture. That's a problem too. To the climate, you know, so they can work. And when you read, for example, the readings of Zev Srilansky and other early Zionists, you see something very strange. There are Jews in Palestine. Most of them, at that time, actually, you know, are Sephardic Jews who are from that, who have been settled in there for years. People from Morocco, people from Iran, people from Iraq who came over the years and settled in those, and settled in the land, and basically became, you know, part of the fabric of the Palestinian society of the time. Now, okay, there are about 50,000 of those. How about hiring them? Well, there's a problem. They tend to be, first of all, they tend to live on, you know, donations that come from the outside, being Orthodox. The second thing is, and they point out that these people are very, very strong. Smilansky, for example, at some point says, you know, a Persian Jewish worker can carry more grapes on his shoulders, like 3 times as more grapes on his shoulders than any Ashkenazic worker that they come. Okay? It's kind of amazing how they play over all of these stereotypes and so on. But it's probably clear that these people can work. The problem with these people is that actually they are seasonal workers. In other words, they are actually part of the old traditional economy in Palestine. There's a season of harvesting the grapes, you go to work. Then you're done, you go back home. You don't work. Now, in the capitalist economy that they want to develop, this doesn't work this way because capitalism doesn't work according to seasons. You know, you need to manufacture, you need to actually manipulate nature in order to produce more. So the 56,000 Mizrahi Jews, let me call them Mizrahi Jews, you know, to use a much more contemporary jargon, are no good. So they hitch up with a program. And this is where the Indian Ocean comes in. Okay? They decide to go to Yemen and bring Jews from Yemen and basically convert them into laborers. This is the context of the very famous Shmuel Yavnieli mission to Yemen. Now, that's a very, very famous case. The story is that, you know, a Zionist socialist pioneer by the name of Shmuel Yavnieli was dressed as a Hasidic Jew, went in 1910 to Yemen, and did, you know, some sort of a missionary work there, you know, to entice the Jews to come to Palestine, so they can start working. That's the idea, and you know, there are serious debates among Zionist historians about that. Ashkenazic Zionist historians claim that, you know, Yemeni Jewry was not particularly Zionist. They didn't really care about, you know, coming to Israel, to the land of Israel, etc. You know, they were very, very religious. And, you know, Yavnieli basically ignites that thing. Okay? The Zionist flame in their hearts, and they come. Yemeni Zionist historians, and there's a whole cluster of Yemeni Zionist historians in Israel, feel very, very insulted about that, and they reverse the argument. They say, no, you know, actually they were always very, very Zionist, you know, and that's why they came. Okay? And there's a complete debate. Enter me into this. Okay? I put my big Iraqi nose into this Yemeni Ashkenazi controversy. And I read Yavnieli. And what I see there, that actually the conversation there in his report is first of all about labor, okay? And this is what they're talking about. And it's beautiful. First of all, let me just tell you like how he defines the mission. He defines the mission, he calls it, this mission has an Agit Zionist value, or in Hebrew, Agit Tzioni. Yes, what is Agit Zionist value? Zionist agitation. And this is kind of, philologically, is a very interesting term, because if you know anything about early Soviet history, which is only beginning 10 years later, agit prop, yes, means, you know, basically Soviet propaganda. Okay? So it's actually kind of a Russian-inspired term that they use in this time. So he's going to do agit prop. Okay? This is how this is marketed in Palestine before he leaves. However, when he gets there, when you read it really, really carefully, you discover that basically he discovers the realities of the Indian Ocean and the story of a very, very small community that sits on one of the most important nodes, eastern nodes of the Indian Ocean, which is the Aden Hodeidah ports in Yemen. Yes, as the Indian Ocean, you know, turns into the Red Sea. And this is a new Red Sea, new Indian Ocean. This is like 3 or 4, this is 4 decades after the digging of the Suez Canal. So actually the transportation of goods is much better. It's much more massive at that period. Okay? And then you basically begin to realize that what he's doing actually, and the reason why they pick Yemeni Jews as opposed to Iraqi Jews, who did come to Israel, did come to Palestine before simply crossing the Syrian desert and coming, you know, or Maghrebi Jews who come in 1840 and settle in Tiberias and so on. So the early Zionists, you know, they go to Yemen specifically because of that Indian Ocean connection. There is a transportation. Now, if you look at the history of Yemeni Jewry migrations and migrations to Palestine in this period, you will find evidence as early as the 14th century that they were coming all the time because of the Red Sea connection. I mean, they would get to, you know, before the Suez Canal, they would basically come to where, you know, Asia and Africa meet. You know, this is before the Suez Canal, and then via the land do that. This is how trade in the Indian Ocean worked between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean for centuries before the digging of the Suez Canal. Why do I say centuries? Let's say millennia. Okay? And I'm serious. So, but now you have a much more massive transportation, you know, between the major hub of production, which is India, and eventually Manchester, but all the way in the Middle East. And the Yemeni Jews, are kind of in one of the nodes, yes? And of course, the port of Hodeidah, I don't know about the port of Aden, but the port of Hodeidah is in the news all the time because it's being bombed all the time now, right now, okay? And if you think about the Houthis and their role in, disrupting Indian Ocean trade right now and global trade right now, you see what I'm talking about, okay? Basically, it's a very, very strategic location. That's why Yemeni Jews were chosen. So when Yavneeli goes there, okay, and you really read very carefully what he says, you discover that basically this is indeed, it's not an agit-prop Zionist mission to light the flame of Zionism in a Jewish community. It's about something completely different. It's about, looking for a possibility to turn them into laborers. And remember, there are two categories of potential laborers already in Palestine, but neither of them is good. First of all, you have the Palestinians who, would work for low wages, but, we don't want them. And the second is all of the Sephardic Jews who already live there and are adapted to the climate and part of the fabric of society, but they have their other ideas about what labor means, very, very traditional. So, here's why, this is why they bring in the Jews. And then he describes, actually he says, as I land, I see massive amounts of cotton coming in. Now, what do you mean by massive amounts of cotton coming in? This is precisely, and you need to imagine, the age of the capitalism in the age of steam, 19th century, early 20th century, where cotton basically transforms what we call global industry. A lot of cotton comes from India all the way to the Mediterranean and to Europe, and it passes by Yemen, and they drop some of it in Yemen. Okay. And then he also counts how many blacksmiths they have there, Jewish blacksmiths. He talks about their various traditional and so on, and he actually describes an economic situation in which Jews do traditional Jewish traditional jobs, basically craftsmen, working with metal, nothing, anything but farming, basically. Okay, craftsmen and so on. And then he also describes an interesting situation that shows why is it that Yemen doesn't become a hub of industry, yes, despite the massive amounts of cotton that he describes elsewhere. Because he says when they take them off the boats, they put them on camels. Now, why camels are important? Because the amount of cotton that a camel can take is, at the end of the day, very limited. Okay? And that dictates that, when you take it to the producer who's going to weave it, turn the cotton into textile, it will have to be still small amounts. And yet, when you read Yavneeli, you see that Yavneeli describes that you have a lot of weavers. And basically, the weavers are, he says, hardly anyone is hired. Okay? Hardly anyone is hired. He talks about basically a very small industry that is done in private households on a very, very, very small scale. That because of the means of transportation, remember the camels can never really grow into something much more massive. So in other words, we have here a very interesting account. And by the way, he doesn't really discuss why they don't become a major industry. This is my analysis, but I read, his account about, the transportation of cotton inland, inside Yemen, yes, where there are no railroads and no trains and no trucks and so on. So actually, the way in which you unload the cotton and push it into the industry there is rather limited and can never grow into something much bigger than that. Okay. And that dictates the entire Jewish economy there, basically. No one is hired, and you really make a point about that, which is another clue why, they were really wanted to see if these people are hireable, okay? And, if they are able-bodied, he specifically says, are they able-bodied? In other words, can we bring them and turn them into agricultural laborers in a capitalist mode in Palestine, which is what they need. So he described that situation, and we have here a very interesting situation about, how, a local economy remains local because it has very traditional means of transportation that are not modern, and basically they can't really develop a capitalist economy in Yemen. Okay. We don't have a lot of time. I hope I described the picture more or less. Let's now bring these people to Palestine. So after some agitprop, yes, some 300 or 400 people do come, okay? And it's actually some small number, but actually it's a massive amount of number compared to how many Jewish laborers you have in this new industry of capitalist agriculture that is developing in Palestine at that point. It actually is quite a lot, okay? And they come, and they fail. They completely fail. In fact, and I will tell you in a minute how we know that, and then I will close. In fact, a lot of them die. They can't adapt. They can't really develop, into, serious workers and serious planters. Many of them end up trying to be hired by wealthier Ashkenazic planters as day laborers or something like that. That doesn't really work well. We have horrible accounts about them being beaten, really terribly mistreated, and eventually they move into small neighborhoods, in emerging Zionist towns such as Rehovot, yes, or of course, in Tel Aviv and elsewhere as well. Okay. Now, so we talk about a situation in which people are brought from traditional economies at the end of the day, despite the fact that they are located in a Central East Indian Ocean node, yes, Yemen. Okay. This is probably why they were picked, by my reading. And the effort is to turn them from their labor degenerate form, yes, which is like basically this is how Zionists sees them, the early Zionists see them, into real productive laborers who actually make money. That doesn't work. They don't produce profit and so on. In fact, many of them die. Okay. So that's pretty much, the kernel of the story, and I'm going to make several comments. First of all, how do I know all of this? Who gives us the information about being mistreated, dying? In some places, in some of the enclaves where they are settled, you have about 100 people, 100% mortality of the children and the babies. Okay, very, very serious hunger. Okay, the reason why we know about this is because we have a report that was done 10 years after this episode, looking at the story of these communities, by none other than Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, future second president of Israel, Zalman Rubashov, future third president of Israel, David Ben Gurion, future prime minister, yes? These are people who are like mega Zionist socialists of the time and future Zionist Israeli leaders later. They actually do a tour in these communities, and they are hostile to the capitalist economy on account that they are socialists. So they have no problem telling us what is really going on. And I'm just going to read you one paragraph. The way Rubashov, who wrote the report about the conditions of these places, talks about what happened there. And he says, when the Yemenis arrive, the landowners, in other words, those Ashkenazic landowners who received land that was already purchased in order to plant on the land and develop capitalist economy, okay, they smelled, and this is my translation, the report was written in Yiddish, and then it was translated into Hebrew twice. It was translated partially into Hebrew, minus all of these condemning, passages, in 1920 at the time that it was produced, and then in 1990 in full into Hebrew. Unfortunately, I don't know Yiddish, so I'm going to work with the Hebrew translation, which is very, very good and very accurate. Okay. So here's what he says. He says, first of all, the landowners immediately, upon arrival of these Yemeni Jews, sense the smell of poverty enfolding those returning brothers. Okay, I mean, Jews do never come to Israel; they return to Israel. And instantaneously, a rumor was spread that these Yemenis do not need much in order to survive. In other words, they can be exploited because they don't need a lot in order to live. And so, a satanic conspiracy, this is his words, not mine. A satanic conspiracy was born to keep them in their misery and turn them into an object for exploitation as a cheap labor force that would satisfy the appetite and the lifestyles of the landowners who had exploited the Bedouins and the Arab Falachin for years. In other words, in few lines, he tells us the whole logic of what is happening in that time. Some Middle Eastern Jews from a very traditional economy that is so traditional that because of all sorts of, that is again my reading, because of all sorts of very objective conditions in the country of origin, basically never really developed into something that we can call capital economy, are brought into an emerging capital, aspiring emerging capitalist economy in Palestine. But these people who want to exploit them basically wanted to reduce them to a situation that they will work for less wages than the Bedouins and the Falachin, who are already being exploited, but they need to be pushed out. So in other words, you need to create a type of a laborer that works very less than that. That is the situation as much as I read it. And indeed, one of the things that they did, these planters or landowners did, they went to the settling services and they basically convinced them to give the Yemenis plots that are 1/300th smaller, okay, than the plots that Ashkenazic landowners were given by the land that was purchased by the Zionist establishment. Okay, so that they won't be able to live off of this land, won't be able to produce, and then they will become laborers. That was the whole part of what he calls the satanic plan. Okay. That backfired big time because he continues to describe a situation in various settlements that they visit, and he describes very horrible conditions. And he has a very hostile tone, because this is a competing Zionist approach, plus these people are seriously, I suggest that we take them as seriously as socialists to do that. I will close with two words. What are the implications for the history of Middle Eastern Jews later on? Okay. If we think about the history of Zionism, actually, is a history of bringing Jews to the Holy Land and turning them into laborers. Yes. In a kind of what we can call a tutelage capitalism, in other words, capitalism that is built from above by importing a lot of capital from without, Rothschilds, then later on Yemeni Jewry, etc., reparations from Germany, but turning these people into laborers. Okay, this means a lot of coercion. Now, if you know anything about the situation in the history of Middle Eastern Jews, after 48, where massive amounts of them come, some of them expelled, some of them come after 48, you will realize that, the State of Israel developed very effective mechanisms, not satanic at all, but no less coercive, in order to drive these people and turn them into laborers as well. We're talking about vocational schools and tracking into vocational schools. We're talking about discrimination in the army, which determines how you're going to, what's your career going to be later. We're talking about the way where people were settled and what vocations they were assigned to do. People were sent to factories, they were sent to do. And again, most of Middle Eastern Jewry, like your world Jewry, basically were like small craftsmen, and middlemen. Okay, so what I'm proposing to see is to see the history of Zionism, particularly with the question of, half of the population, the Jewish population of Israel, which is Middle East Jewry, is a story of coerced proletarization. Okay, that begins with a colossal tragedy that later on develops much more sophisticated mechanisms, in order to turn people into laborers, and that is. The root of all of that, I would argue, begins with this very small episode in 1910, between 1910 and 1920. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tzvi. We will go to our second speaker, who is a very junior scholar, just finished his PhD. Yes. So, Dr. Eirik Kvindesland finished his PhD in Oxford, research on the history of Middle Eastern Jews between Iran, the Persian Gulf, and Israel-Palestine. Okay? He did his BA here in SOAS. I supervise his ISP, so it's very nice to see him here. And he will talk about Jews of the Persian Gulf, the making of an oceanic network and its meaning for Middle Eastern history. Let me choose. Not yet.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be back at SOAS, where I once did my first courses in Arabic and Hebrew. I wrote my thesis with Yair. So I'm going to talk. I'm going to give you sort of a brief overview of my recent research into Persian Gulf Jewish history, which I think we should get on screen in just a minute. Fantastic. Thank you. I put the title of my talk being Jews of the Persian Gulf, the making of an oceanic network and its meaning for Middle Eastern history. So I'm going to try and take one case, one particular and very underexplored piece of Jewish history in the Persian Gulf, and try and say something about what that means for the Persian Gulf's relationship to the Indian Ocean, and also this particular Jewish history's implications for wider Middle Eastern history, and how we understand these various regions and ethnicities as interconnected. So I will start with a little anecdote. So what Jewish history are we really talking about here? I'll start with an anecdote about a TV series that aired in most of the Arab Gulf states in 2020 during Ramadan. This series was called Harun, and it was about a fictional Jewish community in some generic Arab Gulf state, possibly Kuwait, possibly Bahrain. The place wasn't really disclosed in the series itself. Centering on Harun, a female Jewish community doctor who served as sort of a node in a local Jewish community. The series told the story of how Harun tended to her Jewish patients, her Christian patients, and also to Muslims during the interwar years, the 1930s, 1940s, and even maintained amicable communal relations with other religions during the 1940s, 1948, as the State of Israel was established. And this was really the first time, as far as I know, the first time in the public sphere of the Arab Gulf states that that Jews were shown to be an integral part of local Gulf Arab society. This series immediately caused an uproar in most of the Gulf states. Critics saw it as a sign that the governments of the Gulf states, who generally tend to control the media quite heavily, they saw this series as a prelude to normalization with Israel, a sort of cultural sign that something was coming up, and that narratives like these of Arab Gulf citizens living side by side with Jews would form the sort of cultural narratives that would enable Gulf states to normalize its diplomatic relations with the State of Israel. So while some of this criticism seemed kind of out of place when it came, it was soon more or less confirmed by events when Israel, only a few months later, signed what is later became known as the Abraham Accords with the United Arab Emirates and with Bahrain, facilitated by Donald Trump and Jared Kushner. I'm not going to go into that story too much. And the synagogue in Bahrain, which was called the House of the Ten Commandments, became kind of a focal point of this local Gulf Jewish history that served as a legitimating narrative for a deal, what essentially was a security collaboration, a deal between Bahrain and the State of Israel. And this is really what pulled me into this topic. because Gulf Jewish history was clearly politicized. But no one really knew what this history was. I started looking in the archives, started looking in libraries. There's no book on Gulf Jewish history. This history that now serves such an important political purpose didn't actually exist in terms of academic research, which I found extremely curious. So I started asking questions: where did the Jews come from? Were they always lived in the Gulf? What was their relationship to surrounding countries? What was their relationship to Zionism? And to put it very simply, who was the real Harun? This fictional character, who was the real person behind this? The reason, I've been speculating, why didn't this history exist as books or as publications? And that has a lot to do with political and historical silencing, but also what I somewhat unscholarly called cocooning of Jewish history. So if we look, for example, at general histories of the Persian Gulf, we have two examples here. Kali el-Qadri's book called Al-Khalij al-Arabi, Bahr al-Asatir, sort of classic Arab nationalist, pan-Arab book that essentially claims the Gulf, this water between the Arab Gulf states and Iran, as an Arab space. You find very sort of complementary narratives in the Persian language Iranian historiography claiming the same space to be Persian. In neither of these narratives do Jews figure at all. It's exclusively either a Muslim Arab story or an Iranian Persian story. Jews don't fit in there. Same thing happens with in modern histories of the Gulf states, local histories of Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, etc. Jews simply don't figure. But even in the scholarly literature that supposedly was going to explore this, the early studies of Middle Eastern Jewish history doesn't mention the Gulf either. I've just put up a few examples here, including Nitrei Israel, written by Yitzhak Ben Zvi, which Zvi just talked about here, which is one of the early examples of this narrative of the Edot HaMizrach, the communities of the East, that Ashkenazi Jewish historians are very interested in exploring and rediscovering and taking up from their dull past outside of history. Now, there's also newer history. Here we have two books called Al-Yahud fil Khalij, the Jews in the Gulf, Tarikh Yahud al-Khalij, books that came out just after Harun. Seemingly history books that complement the narrative of coexistence that was developed in the TV series. None of them are particularly scholarly. They're very scantily based on historical sources. So there's a lot more to look into here. What is interesting about these new narratives of Gulf Jewish history is that they cocoon Jewish communities as small religious entities that are disconnected from local and regional politics. And most importantly, they don't say a word about Zionism. So seemingly the main question here, what was, if we think about modern Jewish history, how is it affected by Zionism, how is it affected by Israel? These books simply just avoid the topic completely. I mentioned how Persian and Arab historiographies claim this Gulf, this salty stretch of water, as Arab or Persian. So clearly, the name of this sea, this inlet, this corner of the Indian Ocean, depends on which history you want to tell. So if we're going to look at a Jewish history of the Gulf, was there ever such thing as a Jewish Gulf? And now, before anyone accuse me of Zionist expansionism and conspiracies here, I rush to add that we're talking about this in a cultural sense. Was there ever such thing as a Jewish culture in the Persian Gulf? Can we think of this as a Jewish space? There is no such thing in the primary sources. I haven't found, this is completely of my own invention, but I still find it to be a useful historical lens. And I more precisely use the word Gulf Jews, insist on using the word Gulf Jews to see if there is a particular, if we set that as a lens, if there can come a particular culture into view. A bit of, this is a long talk of 45 minutes that I'm now trying to squeeze into half an hour, so I'll move quickly through the background stuff here. I got quite a bad map here, don't take it too literally, but it gives you a sense of the imperial geography of the Persian Gulf in the late 19th century. This is, 1882. So we need to think about the Gulf as part of the Indian Ocean. Gulf being here, the Red Sea that Svi talked about being here, both of them being corners, inlets, or as we would say in Norway where I come from, fjords that extend from the Indian Ocean. What is particular about the Gulf at this time is that it's subject to overlapping imperial forms of governance. So here we have the Ottoman Empire coming down from Turkey, the Qajar Empire in Iran, and British India moving across the seas and imposing its power and influence through the sea coming in from the east. Here, this seems like there seems to be neat borders between these zones. But the fact is that most of the Gulf ports in this area are subject to overlapping forms of governance. Let's say the Qajar Empire might have been able to extract taxes from farmers around a certain port, whereas the local British agent or governor might have been taxing the trade. The local empire might have been more assertive in religious affairs, whereas Britain was much more assertive in terms of regulating trade. So all of the port cities here are subject to conflicting and ever-evolving overlapping forms of governance. In most of the British imperial historiography of this area, the Persian Gulf is in this period framed as a British lake, mainly because all these histories are written based on British sources. If we read local sources, we see this to be a much more complicated story, where both the Ottomans and the Iranian Qajar Empire actually assert quite significant claims to governance in the area. Okay, let's return to the actual Jewish history here. The argument that I'm making in this talk, or one of the arguments that I'm making, is that between the 1820s and the 1880s, there was a persistent trickle of Jewish migration from the hinterland of the Gulf, from the inland cities within the Qajar Iranian Empire and in Ottoman Iraq, towards the Gulf cities, towards the Gulf ports. And by the end of the 19th century, around 1900, there are fairly large and prospering Jewish communities in almost all of the port cities you see around here. A lot of them come from Ottoman and Iranian metropoles, particularly Shiraz, Baghdad, Basra is already a Gulf city, big cities in the inland with large Jewish communities who move towards the Gulf. I'm going to simplify this and talk about it in terms of push factors and pull factors. So within the interior of these empires, thinking about Shiraz, thinking about Baghdad, there is a political reassertion taking place. The capitals, be that Istanbul or Tehran, are trying to reassert increasing power over their peripheries, responding to the British challenge coming from the south in the Persian Gulf. This causes a complete turmoil in local politics. And local Jewish traders who possibly had patronage relations to local rulers, existing trade networks and power relations are upended. So in the middle of the 19th century, many trade networks collapse and are reframed and retransformed. The famous story of Albert Sassoon, who leaves Baghdad, I believe it's 1831 or 32?
Yeah. David Sassoon.
Yeah, David Sassoon. Who leaves in the 1830s for Baghdad towards the Gulf, is very much one of these stories. The Mamluks, who up until then ruled Baghdad, were overturned by the Central Ottoman Empire reasserting power, and everything changed in terms of local politics. The Sassoon family briefly has a stay in Bushehr, in this port city on the Iranian side, but very quickly moves on to India, where there is much more to be gained and a much wider market to be accessed. Another factor here is Muslim Jewish sectarianism, which follows from the fact that many of these Jewish trading families, in many cases, were importers of British imperial goods, be it cotton or spices from India, other import new, cheaper imports that represented fierce competition to local production. And the economic competition that then emerged with the British entry into the Gulf caught the Jews in sort of an economic, ethnic, in some locations, Jewish economic, ethnic competition. Complementary to this were pull factors. The surging India trade, as the British Empire moved in, the port cities were increasingly connected to India, trade was growing, and British patronage, which I will get to very soon. We're going to explore this a bit more by talking about two particular cities, the city of Bushehr and Bahrain. So just the city of Bushehr became home to the largest Jewish community in the Gulf. It was the center or the home of the British Gulf residency, and was also the main port accessing the Persian interior. Most imports coming to the Gulf and going to Iran went through this particular port. And by the 1880s, it became home to a mixed Baghdadi Persian Jewish community of some 2,000 individuals, based on various very rough estimates from sources by missionaries, British observers, etc., but roughly 2,000 individuals, who traded actively with India and with the Iranian interior in exporting wine from Shiraz. The grape is not from there, apparently, but there was a large Jewish wine industry in that area. Opium as well, going into the wider British colonial network, but also textiles, silverware, etc. Sources indicate that from Bushehr and into the Iranian hinterland, there was an extensive Jewish trading network. And my argument here is that in this port city of Bushehr, there emerges a particular Gulf Jewish way of life. So Iranian Jews and Baghdadi Jews who settle here intermingle and produce a mixed Baghdadi Arabic Persianate Jewish culture that is adapted to the ways of life in the Gulf itself. We'll follow up on that argument in a little bit. Just to give you a sense of the riches of this place, I'm going to read a quote to you written by Raphael Chaim Cohen, an Iranian rabbi who migrated through Bushehr as a young boy and wrote about his experiences. In the city of Bushehr, there are about 500 families of our people. Most of them are well-to-do, and among them are great merchants who trade with the cities of India, Basra, Baghdad, London, and other European cities. Among them are also representatives of the great shipping companies operating on these coasts. Most of them are traders and money exchangers and work within the city itself. And Raphael Chaim Cohen, he's in awe of this very prosperous community in Bushehr. He writes about how large their synagogues are, the enormous wax candles they have, how they all wear clean clothes, whereas the village that he himself came from, that wasn't always the case. So in this narrative, there's a clear sense that this community is a lot richer. And that's also confirmed by other English sources and other traveler sources. Across from the Gulf, on the other side, on the Arab side, a smaller community also emerges at the same time. So as Bushehr reaches its peak, seemingly in the 1890s, what we may call a satellite community emerges in Bahrain on the other side. Bahrain is also subject to British rule. Comes under British protectorate treaties in the 1820s. By the 1890s, there is a large British presence with a British agent that is operating in sort of double rule with the local Arab tribal family. And Britain here exercises what we may call a protective policy towards Jews. Similar to the idea of Jews as middlemen of empire that he just talked about, there is a similar notion taking place among British officials here of looking at local Jews as potential mediators between the British imperial commerce and the local economy. based on their knowledge of languages, but also what we may call a philo-Semitism, a sort of fetishization of Jews as ideal middlemen. And this was very much at work in Bahrain. I'm going to quote you here briefly from a case that emerged in 1906 when the local ruler, Isa ibn Ali, moved to tax the local Jewish community. They were residents in Bahrain, he wanted to tax them. No one wants to pay tax, so the local Jewish merchants complained to the local British agent. The sheikh is trying to tax us, please help us escape this tax. And from this followed a long report and a long exchange of letters from the local agent with his superiors both in London and in India. What to do? I'm going to just read out of one of the middle sentences there where the local agent, Francis Prideaux, writes, "I was aware, however, that the British government took considerable interest in the welfare of Jews in Persia, to the extent even of occasionally intervening diplomatically on their behalf. And I therefore felt little doubt that they would expect me to assist the Bahrain Jews in any difficulty which might beset them on account of their religion, and to demand their exemption from appearing in the court of the Qazis, as in appearing in the local court system and being subjected to tax." So here we interestingly have local British representatives who consistently, both in Iran and in Bahrain, move to protect Jewish communities from local rule, essentially. This is also the time when the local pearl trade in Bahrain was flourishing, economic growth, strong, explicit British protection for Jewish migrants. So no wonder why a local Jewish community emerged there in this period. These cities that now given you two examples. We've got similar stories taking place in Kuwait, possibly also in Basra. The other ports, I'm not sure yet. There's still more research to be done there. But one of the central arguments that I'm making here is that these connect in what is an oceanic Jewish community network, tied together by family businesses, by business, by family connections, and also by religious links. There's a fantastic story, for example, of the first Bushehi Jews that go to settle in Bahrain in the 1890s. They don't have a rabbi, they don't have a Jewish slaughterer, a shochet, and they keep purchasing meat from the other side, from Bushehr. Also, unhappy married Jewish couples in Bahrain would go to Bushehr to get their divorces settled, because apparently that's where the rabbis were more skilled at dealing with these matters. So there are numerous community services here taking place, crossing the Gulf. This Jewish community network, it peaks in the 1890s, essentially when the British-India trade also peaks, but it persists into the 1940s, through various changes through the First World War and even past the Second World War as well. This story is not unique in the sense that there are similar communities that do very similar things, other places in the Indian Ocean. Yemenite Jews establish a very comparable network in the Red Sea. Many people at SOAS will know about the Hadramis communities of Yemen, who also established similar community and trading networks across the Indian Ocean, which further supports the argument that this is essentially a Gulf Jewish network. I argue that these Jewish communities were just as Khaliji as they were Jewish, because they were mixed Arab-Persian, they spoke both Persian and Arabic, and they adapted their ways of life to the local nature of the Gulf. One of the most famous examples being Jewish ritual baths, mikvaot, being built into the sea and using seawater rather than fresh water, because there isn't that much sweet fresh water to be used in baths in the Gulf. So even ritual practices are adapted to the place. How much time do I have?
I think about 10 minutes.
Oh, okay, fantastic.
9 minutes.
Fantastic. Now, I say that this network peaked in the 1890s. Many people also leave. Once these port communities are connected with ships and with across the Gulf, they're also very well connected to the Indian Ocean, and hence the world seas. So the connection of this community network to the wider global emerging capitalist economy opens doors. It opens doors to India, to Shanghai, to the Far East, as we very clearly see with the case of the Sassoon family, but also westwards towards the Mediterranean. The Suez Canal, built in 1869, the corollary or connected trade networks of steamships crisscrossing the Gulf, going around the peninsula, through the canal into the Mediterranean, developed by the 1880s, roughly. And there's a serious functioning trading system there that actually connects all of the Gulf ports and the Gulf Jewish communities directly to Suez, and thereby to late Ottoman Palestine. And this causes a trickle. This causes a very rapturous change in the 1890s of Gulf Jews leaving the ports. And here I'm just going to quote to you the writing of a local government official in Bushehr, and also later on historian, who wrote, I think in 1913, "The Jews of Iranian nationality currently make up 100 households. Before they used to be more. In Bushehr they have 2 neighborhoods, and lately they have been busy emigrating to Jerusalem, Quds Sharif, as it was written in Persian, and the Levant, and become fewer. In Bushehr they are money changers, spice dealers, and produce date arak, one of the wine exports of southern Iran, alcoholic exports." And no one really understood, and this particular government official wasn't, he didn't really understand what was going on here. But if we look to what's happening in Jerusalem around the same time, we get a stronger sense of the emigratory and more global story that is taking place there. Because around the beginning of the 20th century, up until 1914, a Persian Jewish community emerges in Jerusalem. Mainly people of Bushehri origin. The first Persian synagogue that is built in Jerusalem in, I believe it's 1893 or 94, is called Beit HaKnesset Urlei Bushehr, or the synagogue of the Bushehr immigrants. That's the first Persian synagogue that emerges. This community has around 1,500 members by 1914, and it's truly the evidence of the linking of the Indian and the Mediterranean Ocean that happened with the Suez Canal and with the global transport networks that emerge here as well. While Jerusalem had previously been a faraway place for Iranian Jews, a place that it would take at least 2 months to get to, traveling across several deserts at a high cost and also very high risk, Jerusalem can now be reached with a ticket on a British steamer. Still expensive, but much less risky, much less reliable, much more reliable, allowing larger groups of collective migration to there. The big story here is about connectivity. The Jewish story, as many of these migrants tell themselves, is that they went for religious reasons. It's mostly younger rabbis who want to start a new Jewish community, new Jewish practices, and leave behind the older rabbis who don't want to emigrate to Palestine. There's a messianic element in here. We see in some of their family histories that they refer to their grandfathers who came first as fiercely messianic, interested in just waiting for the Messiah to come very soon. So there's a mix here of religious motivations and of geographical and oceanic connectivity. In any case, it links the Gulf ports to Jerusalem in what I would say is not unprecedented ways, but in volumes and scales that we didn't see before the emergence of these networks. So, a few conclusions. Is this a Jewish Gulf, or is it Gulf Jews? I would argue it's not a Jewish Gulf. This history doesn't make the Gulf Jewish, but there is certainly a Gulf Jewish story to be told there on part of its cultural complexity and cultural mix between Arabic culture and Persian culture, which is really in many cases the essence of Gulf society. But also for its connectivity to the wider Indian Ocean and eventually to Palestine. The Jewish history here really inserts a large element of diversity into Gulf history that has long been dominated by empires, oil, national histories, and very much national histories that try to divide the Gulf in two, between an Arab side and a Persian side. The Jewish story shows that this is a lot more complex and a lot more interconnected. There's also a connectivity argument here about how new modern connections between the Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea create new religious entanglements between Iranian Jewish communities and with Palestine. And in terms of the Zionist histories that we just heard about, I mean, this is clearly, these are people who come to modern Palestine completely on their own volition. These are people who choose to migrate. They can also choose to stay. It's got very little to do with Zionism and ambitions for control or ambitions for statehood. It's a religious migration that is also motivated by opportunity. I wouldn't say opportunism, but with the possibility of starting a new life. Which reframes a lot of the Zionist history previously attached to describing Middle Eastern Jewish communities. So I think I'll round off there, and I look forward to hearing your questions.